What do you do when being simple is just not good enough? When the reductions and simplicities we use, when keeping it simple stupid, just do not work? Well, when simplicity fails, we call the answer Remedy 101. No matter where we look, we are being urged that simplicity is the answer. In an age of ever-increasing complicatedness and complexity, we are told the answer lies with simplicity. Being simple is the right way to go. Less is more. Keep it simple, stupid. There is great power in simplicity. Simplicity, it seems, is the key to success. After all, the pathways to success can be very complicated and very complex. It is so much easier to go around the maze than to have to go through it. There is a relationship, or so it's asserted, between simplicity and effectiveness. When we make things simple, we make them more effective. Staples even calls this relationship the easy button. But the world isn't just simple. Oftentimes we encounter ambiguity. If we believe in the simplicity-effectiveness relationship, then ambiguity can get in the way of our success. Ambiguity challenges our notion of the simple. Should everyone have the same airplane seat? Caitlyn Jenner wanted to know why there were no urinals in the ladies' room. Before the financial crisis, AAA ratings meant something, and then they didn't. Ambiguity seems to counter simplicity. It makes things less effective, less easy to get done, more confusing. In truth, what ambiguity does is introduce two kinds of uncertainty. One is known as there's multiple values for the same thing, and I am uncertain as to which value is the appropriate one. But the second is a far more dangerous kind of uncertainty. Uncertainty with a capital U. The I don't know what to do, I react like a deer in the headlights kind of uncertainty. Achieving simplicity can be very hard when ambiguity is to be found everywhere. The solution is not to just put out more and more of the same things. When you do that, you get something like this very cumbersome Swiss Army knife. It purports to be a simple solution that is able to do just about everything, but it is so cumbersome that you really can't use it to do anything. When simplicity isn't obvious, when it doesn't just present itself to us, what we do is we create it. Sometimes, in fact most of the time, the simplicity we deal with is actually our own construction, a product of our own heads, our own minds, and our own beliefs. What we do is create our own reality. We see the world. We process the world. But the way we process it is to tell a story which makes sense of what it is we think we see, of what it is we think we need to deal with. And most of the time, we will tell a simple story. We say the world is X, or the world is Y, or the world is Z. What we do is filter the reality that we see. How? First, we limit our field of attention. We narrow the context of what it is we are dealing with. Then, we limit the factors to be considered. We assert a set of boundaries and constraints. Then, we predict likely outcomes given the boundaries and constraints that we just imposed. In effect, at this point, we have constructed our own realities. Finally, we pick among those realities. By choosing from amongst our predictions, we have taken the complex, complicated reality that we first encountered, and we have turned it into a simple construct, our simple construct. These simple constructs are everywhere. We see it in the Staples Easy button. We see it in Nike's slogan, "Just do it." We see it in the Apple assertion that it just works. When faced with the choice of going for the complex route or the simple route, the choice we most often make is to go for the simple. Of course, sometimes that simplicity is not necessarily the clear, unambiguous answer that we seek. Indeed, simplicity does not mean certainty. Certainty itself can be quite elusive, as shown here. Do you see the peasant girl? Do you see the man? Do you see both? Can you see both at the same time? It's ambiguous. A problem with ambiguity and the lack of certainty is that the simplicity that we seek may not be shared by other people. It's not that they do not share our goal, it's that they see something different than what we see. One of us saw the peasant girl. Another of us saw the man. This lady sees 4. This man sees 3. And we tell the story we see, not the story that others around us see. It seems that the simplicity and effectiveness graph only applies when there is agreement and certainty with regard to meaning and context. This means we need to redefine the graph. The greater the amount of similarity which multiple observers find regarding the situation at hand, the greater the amount of acceptability they will attribute to it. That is, the greater the willingness they will have to enter into a real dialogue about the subject at hand, and not be arguing instead about what it is that's being seen, what it is that's being meant, and how we should go about resolving the underlying disagreements and ambiguities. When there is disagreement, there can be dissonance. Ambiguity creates many such opportunities for dissonance. The surprise is what you see towards the right-hand side of this graph. In general, as similarity increases, acceptability increases, but only up to a point. Somewhere in the neighborhood of the 70% similar range, everything seems to fall off the cliff. Multiple people can't agree on the other 30%, and their lack of agreement produces dissonance, sometimes very sharp dissonance. We call this the chasm of dissonance. It's a very important but seldom discussed pitfall when trying to sort out ambiguity. Let's try this with an example. I imagine we are all very familiar with the climate change debate. When you look at the graph of temperatures usually used to display global warming, this is the graph you tend to see. Please notice the red line that slopes upward toward the right-hand side. When scientists and others who support the notion that global warming is an ever-present and ongoing problem speak about this graph, this trend line is the conception they have in mind. But there is another way to look at exactly the same data. Instead of drawing one overall trend line, one can look for periods of stability amongst the rising trend. This is what the current version of this graph shows. It's drawn with the same data, it has the same data points, but it offers a different interpretation. When contrarians suggest that there are opportunities where the rise in global temperatures have slowed or stabilized, it is this interpretation of the graph which they are talking about, drawn with the same data, the same graph, and a different interpretation. These clashing interpretations are illustrative of what happens in the chasm of dissonance. We have a high level of similarity, but we have two conflicting interpretations, and as a result, people engage in fairly strong disagreements. The simple lesson here is that context matters. The slice of pizza, which seems very appealing, while on the restaurant plate on the left, seems to be anything but appealing while sitting on the manhole cover on the right. We can look at some historic illustrations of the importance of context. In 1981, Bill Gates, yes, that Bill Gates, said that 640K should be enough for anybody. Funny, I have 128 gigs on my cell phone. Or, to take a different example from 100 years before that, consider Western Union's reaction to the telephone. This telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value to us. Clearly, their reality did not encompass our reality of today. Try to get your kid off of his cell phone. Ambiguity, uncertainty, disagreement, and dissonance all can get in the way of the simplicity-effectiveness relationship. Our solution for this is the black box. The kind of black box we are talking about is not the one found on airplanes, which record all of the data available to it for some given time. Instead, the black box is a logical tool that we use to simplify the world. This black box consists of the linkage between some input X and some output Y, where what goes on between X and Y is hidden from us. It is the black box which we assert contains the relationship between X and Y, and we speak of black boxes like this as if they were real. Black boxes like this are basic building blocks in the stories we tell to ourselves and others about our simple world. We use the black box as if it could make the world simple as we'd like it. We talk about the black box as if what went on inside did not matter. The black box is all that matters. An example is the term our family. We can speak about it as a unit. The words our family are a label or a box inside of which are untold layers of complicatedness and complexity. But we do not need to deal with those layers of complicatedness in the stories that we tell. Many such stories succeed merely by using the words our family. Black boxes are the as-ifs we construct so that the stories that we tell can have simple ingredients. When we use black boxes appropriately, they can package ambiguity and complexity into simplicity. Indeed, that is the very message of the Staples Easy button, or of takeout food, or of the drive-through window, or of Nike's Just Do It. We use black boxes to simplify the world and to try to obtain agreement with one another. Inside the black box is some unknown and perhaps unexamined process. What we are capable of observing is the input to the box and the output from the box. We deliberately ignore the complexities of the mechanisms inside so as to simplify our reality. We speak about the black box as if the mechanism inside did not matter. When telling the story about taking the family up to Vermont to go skiing, I do not need to get into the intricacies of the fights between my daughter and my wife about what clothes to pack, but instead can tell you about the great meal we had when we stopped on Route 7. By using a black box to simplify what it is we are talking about, we can make the complex appear to be simple. But there is a danger. Black boxes can be used inappropriately. When this happens, black boxes proclaim a simplicity which is not present. They encourage us to overlook context and to deny the dependencies on context or on background assumptions that our personal history or the personal histories of the other people we are interacting with depend upon. Instead, they argue that we should use a model or a label. If the model or the label is right, great. But depending on how wrong that model or label is, well, there's the danger of an upcoming disaster. Both of these objects are made of gold. Both are roughly circular in shape. One is a ring. One is something else. If we merely speak of the black box of the approximately round object, we could be very right or we could be very wrong, depending on the context, depending on how we intend to use that black box. If our goal is to model a communication network, then these two model very different things. With inappropriate use, one can drown in ambiguity and in dissonance. Notice that it is important that black boxes be used appropriately. So what is it that the word appropriately actually means? There are two important rules to help us define appropriately. The first is what is called the modeling relation. The modeling relation is what tells us whether we actually have a model or if we merely have a description. A model is something that we can manipulate in the space of our minds or on a computer or on a piece of paper, and then, depending upon what we observe in the model, we can decide how to implement things in real life. A description, by contrast, gives us no such opportunities. Manipulating a description has no implications for what happens in real life. The second such tool is what is known as the law of requisite variety. This law says that the degrees of freedom, the number of variables that are available to be manipulated, which are present in a system, need to be similar in whatever it is that we are trying to use in order to control that system. If the controller has too many degrees of freedom, then things will be lost in uncertainty and ambiguity. If the controller has too few degrees of freedom, then the system will be able to run away with itself. Together, the modeling relation and the law of requisite variety allow us to determine whether or not we have a good fit, whether we are using the black box appropriately for the given situation or the given problem. Appropriately means that we can tell the right kind of stories that will help create the right kind of opportunities. Getting stories and black boxes to be appropriate is the solution for what to do when simplicity fails. The modeling relation helps us to determine whether we are dealing with a model or merely a description. In the chart shown here, the formal system over on the right is a model of the natural system on the left. It is a model because all four of the marked elements are present. There is some notion of causality in the natural system. Activity in the natural system can be encoded into a representation in the formal system. Within the formal system, we can manipulate variables in order to draw inferences. And finally, we can decode the lessons of those inferences and manipulations into some actual implementation in the natural system. To be a model, the formal system has to be present along with all four of these relationships. If any one of them is missing, you have a description and not a model. Models allow you to play. They allow you to experiment. They allow you to understand what might happen. Being able to play and to draw conclusions without having to take actions which have real consequences, is very important. It is the key to allowing you to have resilience. By contrast, when dealing with a description, manipulations can only play with the description itself. They have no real-world consequences. They cannot be decoded into some actual implementation or embodiment in the real world. But remember, pre-given labels and categories are very efficient. Much of our simple world works due to the efficiencies from the use of pre-given labels and categories. Not everything needs a model. The law of requisite variety is a very important concept from cybernetics. It addresses the balance between the degrees of freedom present in a system and the degrees of freedom present in some kind of a controller which is aimed at that system. When the controller has a few degrees of freedom greater than the system trying to be controlled, the system can be stable. Too many excess degrees of freedom, and we have ambiguity and uncertainty. Too few degrees of freedom, and the system has the ability to run away from the controller. Let's take a very familiar example which demonstrates appropriateness and inappropriateness with regard to the use of black boxes and simplicity. This is a map of the London subway system. Please note this map is highly effective if you want to use the subway or the underground to get from one station to another. It is a model of that function. It displays the appropriate requisite variety. But, and it's a key but, this map is next to useless if you actually wish to walk. It does not tell you what direction to go or how to get there. The map was greatly simplified. It is appropriate to its function, and the function is the use of the subway itself. It is not a map of the surface. By contrast, This is a chart that actually has been on exhibit in the London Underground recently. It purports to show you what you would need to do in the underground system if you wish to replicate climbing the summit of various mountains. As a description, it's interesting, but it's not a model. There's no way to take any meaningful action on most of the stairways that are shown here. Indeed, these stations have elevators. Note, actual mountain summits have limited oxygen and rather rugged terrain, not damp, dank, foul-smelling air and an endless set of concrete steps. This description is not a model. It demonstrates no requisite variety. Adding a little information, however, to the basic subway map can help with its appropriateness for walking. While the map itself cannot help you to determine how to walk from one station to another, by adding walking information to the map, you can see how long it might take to actually do the walk. And this version of the map has had the number of minutes of walking time between the stations added. Please note, the same distance on this map shows very different times, which reveals the inadequacy of the map and its inappropriateness to be used to tell you how to walk. What it is appropriate for is to give you some clue as to the time involved. So how do we determine appropriateness? This slide shows you some questions you might ask. Are you presenting a model which can be acted upon? Or are you merely offering up a description? Does your story encompass enough context to address the situation at hand or the problem that you're trying to address? Is your story open or closed to the current context of your listener? And it's the current context of the listener that matters, not some hypothetical context, not some prior context, but the actual now. As a memory device, keep in mind, do not use the London subway map as a guide for how to walk between the stations. In general, there are 4 kinds of narrative that we can tell about black boxes, about our simple models, and each of these is dependent upon the listener. They are the anecdote, the metaphor, the abstraction, and the archetype. When we tell stories of isolated incidents, and we don't necessarily relate them to one another, we are telling anecdotes. When we compare 2 or more things using their similarities and ignoring their differences, we are telling stories that are metaphors, how A is like B. When we isolate the similarities into a category, and we tell a story that is about how the category separates itself from its context, that is an abstraction. And finally, when we tell stories that are exemplars, ideal examples, and when we assert that category membership is determined by the lack of variance from that exemplar, we are making use of archetypes. It is important to realize that quite often we confuse one type of narrative for another, and in doing so, we lose sight of why we are telling the particular kind of story that we are telling. Getting narratives confused is not helpful. If you remember the chasm of dissonance from about 20 slides ago, this graph illustrates how the kinds of narratives we tell maps along the curve of that chasm. Each of the kinds of narratives has a different acceptance potential. Metaphors are less similar than abstract concepts. They have less shared information, but both are widely accepted. A key to their acceptance is that we usually make note that we are speaking metaphorically or abstractly, and thereby allow space for the listener's reaction to the metaphor or abstraction. At the other end of the graph, anecdotes which are very context-specific and therefore filled with information are also highly acceptable and will be perceived of as similar by multiple audiences due to that very context specificity. By contrast, when we tell narratives which involve archetypes, we are making use of our personal background information in order to better identify why this story is in and of itself an exemplar. Others, who possess very different background information, may disagree, and indeed may disagree sharply. And it is in that disagreement that we find the chasm of dissonance. Narratives involving archetypes have the greatest potential for triggering the chasm due to differences in background information which each listener brings to the archetype. The stories we tell, the way we tell them, the kind of narrative we tell, and the kind of black box we use as the subject of those stories all determine how the listener, the observer, finds value and potential opportunities for action in the stories being told. It turns out that there are 6 kinds of black box. Since the kinds matter, we will go through them one at a time. They are the rigid, the malleable, the hooks and snaps, the permeable, the dissolvable, and finally, the chimera-like. Let's begin with the rigid. The rigid says, I am a black box. Accept me as such. Do not probe into my inners. They are hidden from you. I stand alone. Examples of such rigid black boxes can be found, for example, in the living room radio that sat in your parents' or grandparents' house. Few in the house understood how it worked or dared to probe its innards, but it brought news and music from the outside world into the house. It functioned as a standalone black box. In effect, it worked in the same way that Apple suggests that Apple products work, namely, they just work. Do not open. Do not probe. Just accept that they work the way they're intended to work. We can illustrate the kinds of black boxes by looking at the story of spreadsheets. In the beginning, when the spreadsheet was first invented, in the days of Lotus 123, I'm going to take a parenthetical here. How many of you remember when the slogan was, DOS ain't done till Lotus won't run? Spreadsheets were these mythical things that computer people and financial analysts used to prepare reports. The rest of us did not probe what we did not question. We merely looked at the output. The malleable kind of black box is a very different animal. It is capable of being inserted into processes and then being ignored. It is there precisely because we want to place attention on the inputs and the outputs and not on this middle black box device. Some typical examples: the universal charger that plugs into the wall into any of your portable devices. It's there to do its job and to be ignored. Or the way that apps have taken over the ecosystem of smartphones. When we are using apps on the phone, we are ignoring the phone. It has merely become the platform for the operation of the apps, and we're supposed to pay attention to the app, not to the phone. The phone is malleable and is there to be ignored. In the spreadsheet world, an example of a malleable black box is a program called Quicken. Quicken prepares spreadsheets for you using inputs and outputs from other people's programs. It is designed to be as malleable as possible. And when you're using Quicken in its data gathering process or in its report preparation process, it is designed for you not to pay very much attention to how it works. Hooks and snaps are another form of malleable black box. But with these, the activity centers around someplace on the exterior of that black box, where there is a hook or snap which matches some specific context, which itself can be poked or snapped. The idea is that the hooks and snaps would call attention to themselves, and that the very process of what goes on in the black box to which they are attached remains hidden. An ideal example of such a hook and snap black box is how the immune system works, where there are particular folds or particular receptors which attract outside invaders. Using our spreadsheet and Quicken example, Quicken has specific hooks and snaps that allow its spreadsheets to talk to TurboTax for when it's time for you to go do your U.S. federal income taxes. Black boxes become very interesting when their boundaries are permeable, when the box itself includes a vision of how its inner workings work. Permeability means that there's a possibility of interactions with context, that there can be an interchange amongst the context and the contents of the black box. Permeability may be accomplished via a gate, multiple gates, or perhaps holes in the box's boundary. When a black box is permeable, we can see some of what's going on inside it and react to what we can see. When a black box is permeable, processes can take place which affect the interactions and change, perhaps the black box, perhaps the context of that black box, or perhaps the inputs or outputs of the black boxed process. I'm told that in biology, what I've just described is how antigens work. But I will be the first to confess, I am no biologist. In the spreadsheet world, the analogy is with the data exchanges which Quicken and TurboTax make available when they are jointly attempting to function as one of your financial planners. Now, the inner workings do become somewhat visible because some of the mystery has to be revealed if the program is to explain to you why it is recommending path Z. It cannot help you make decisions without exposing some of its inner workings. The ultimate version of permeability is dissolvability. Not only can the boundary be penetrated and seen through, but in the right context, in the right kind of situation, given the right kind of interaction, the boundary can be dissolved. Perhaps the best example of a dissolvable black box is the scientific explanation. When we provide a scientific explanation, we are opening up the mechanisms of how the input becomes the output. While we may refer to the explanation itself by a name or a label, and that name or label then is a boundary, the boundary is fully dissolvable. For example, we might say that X is explained by the law of large numbers, or by the second law of thermodynamics, but the explanation tells us what those things mean and how they work. A scientific explanation provides mechanism and makes the mechanism obvious. The Quicken TurboTax team tries this by becoming your all-in-one financial resource. They have boundaries amongst their products and between their products and their vendors, but the boundaries dissolve and they try to become one integrated solution, your one-stop shop for everything financial. The problem child black box is the one referred to as chimera-like. This black box appears as dissolvable to those who believe in it, to those who see the black box as providing an explanation. But to non-believers, this black box is seen as a type 1 rigid, I am a black box. The obvious examples of such black boxes are religions and any other form of reasoning which demands belief over evidence. In the current age, perhaps we could cite the beliefs of those who announced they would vote for Donald Trump. In the Quicken TurboTax world, the black box nature of how private data was getting shared amongst the products and amongst vendors seemed like efficiency and helpfulness to the folks at Intuit, the company which markets Quicken and TurboTax. But that same sharing seemed like fraud to the federal government. The company was a true believer. The boundaries were dissolved. The government, well, not a believer. And they did not understand how the boundaries were not being abused. We can also look at the 6 kinds of black boxes by telling the story of McDonald's. Type 1, the rigid black box, can be represented by the way a neighborhood zoning board might look at a request for a McDonald's to move in. McDonald's is seen as a solid thing. Its internal processes are irrelevant to the zoning board. They care about the idea of a McDonald's. By contrast, the highway rest stop planner sees McDonald's as a malleable black box. McDonald's is willing to change what they do. McDonald's is willing to change what they sell. McDonald's is willing to change what hours they keep. Anything to make that rest stop work better. Similarly, for the hungry driver on the highway, McDonald's is a hooks and snaps black box. If the driver gets hungry, McDonald's is a place to go. If the driver needs a bathroom, McDonald's is a place to go. If the driver needs a rest stop, McDonald's is a place to go. Whatever hook or snap the driver needs is getting activated, and McDonald's can do it. The permeable type of black box is illustrated by McDonald's recent decision to offer breakfast all day. It is breakfast that gets us into a McDonald's. We all understand the sort of primal mechanism of get an egg McMuffin. Similarly, a McDonald's Happy Meal to a 4-year-old is a prime example of a dissolvable black box. There is no distinction between the Happy Meal itself, the experience of getting the Happy Meal, the experience of eating the Happy Meal, and the experience of sharing the Happy Meal with friends, siblings, or parents. All of these have no distinct boundaries once that Happy Meal is placed in the hands of the 4-year-old. On the other hand, that same Happy Meal, when viewed by the child's vegan parents, now it takes on a chimera-like quality. The child certainly believes in it, while the vegan parents, they're not so sure. But at least it keeps Billy quiet. With all these kinds of black boxes, it is important to remember that the output of the black box is an input to the observer, and that what the observer sees is then an input back into the black box. The black boxes are used to simplify the world, and they are our own construction. They are a product of the observer's mind and brain. It is critical that we think about black boxes always being mindful of this black box observer input-output circuit. To ignore the circuit is to think about things the wrong way. Each of the 6 kinds of black box provides separate context. That context allows for different actions, different behavior, different interpretations, different possibilities, and different narratives. Each kind of black box is observer dependent, and each is very different. The risk lies in not recognizing that you're dealing with 6 kinds of black boxes and 4 kinds of narratives. Each kind of black box and each kind of narrative is different, and it really makes a difference about which one you're using and how. And it is especially true if you're trying to simplify ambiguity or trying to overcome disagreements. You see, simplicity isn't always that simple. Every idea we process, every product, every business, every relationship, they all make use of black boxes in an effort to simplify. The key is deciding which black box, which narrative you're dealing with, and knowing why. Over time, we need to deal with the parts of the world that are not so simple. The lessons that we've learned about the simple world don't necessarily apply in the rest of the world. And while we can attempt to simplify, we have to recognize that not all of the world is simple. Just like Success Baby, our goal is to succeed, and we want to do that regardless of complexity and regardless of ambiguity. The way we do this is by coping. As Richard Rorty told us, knowledge is not a matter of getting reality right, but rather a matter of acquiring habits of action for coping. This whole talk has been about how you might better cope. So how do you cope when simplicity fails? When trying to turn the complicated or the complex into something simple just isn't working? The answer is you have to ask some questions. You have to ask where the failure of the simplicity lies. Is it in the lack of requisite variety? Is it in the kind of narrative you're telling? Is it in the kind of black box that you're using? Or is it in some combination of all 3? It is critical to remember that you want to be talking in terms of models, not descriptions. So you must also recall the modeling relation and use it to examine the situation you are in. You can find simplicity by reconstructing the modeling relation for the given situation. You need to make sure that you actually have a model. If you don't, then you need to determine what it is that you have to do, or you have to change, or you have to know in order to model the situation using the modeling relation. Given the modeling relation, you can rehearse potential actions. And it is in that ability to rehearse that you get resilience and that you find simplicity. So, the complex or the simple? The choice is yours. Thank you for listening.